So we'll continue with the rest of our presentations for this morning. May I have your attention, please? Our next presenter is Jurgen Beier from Deloitte. The title of his presentation is Tracking the Trends 2011, the top 10 issues mining companies will face in the coming year. Jurgen holds a Bachelor's of Engineering, Industrial Engineering from the University of Pretoria, South Africa. In the last 18 years with Deloitte, he has been serving clients in the global resources sector, predominantly in the mining industry. He is deputy leader of the North American mining practice for Deloitte. He has deep experience across the entire mining value chain. In his time with Deloitte, Jurgen has focused on helping global and national mining companies improve the effectiveness and efficiency of their operations. Through his mining work in Canada, Brazil, Chile, US, South Africa, and Australia, Jurgen has developed a global perspective on the mining industry. Please join me in welcoming Jurgen Beier.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Firstly, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you guys today. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the research which Deloitte does every year on the mining industry and what we believe the emerging trends are and the issues are in the mining industry in any given year. This is titled 2011. We typically bring this research out in December of every year, so the 2012 trends will be released in the next 2 months. So please bear in mind that this was released in December of last year. In terms of our methodology, just so that you know where our research comes from and how we collate that, we're obviously a global firm, and we do a survey every year of all our partners who work in all the different geographies in the world, serving many different mining clients. And we really focus or get them to focus on what the issues are that they're experiencing at a local level with their clients in the different countries around the world which we operate in. We then collate that together and distill the 10 top themes out of that. So that's the source of this. I'd like to say thanks to Nathan, firstly, for quoting much of what's in there today. So some of the stuff that's been covered, I'll breeze over. Some of the others I'll go into a little more detail in. Okay. The fickle face of financing, what we really mean by this is if we look at where the financing came from in the mining industry before 2008, the institutional financiers were really the source of the vast majority of the financing for the mining industry. And if we look at where we are today and anything post-2008, it looks very different. The institutions have stepped out of the mining industry to a large extent because of the risk, because of the scares of 2008. And the people or the institutions that have stepped in there are largely China and India. And why is this important? This is very important because if we look at the way finance was raised and the way money was raised in the past, it focused on the professional bankers in the big banking cities in the world, a lot of it in Toronto, established relationships, people who trusted each other and so forth. If we look at how that's happening today, it's a very different style of business. It's a very different entity who many of us don't know much about. Sino-Forest is a good example. It's not a mining company, but it's a different way of doing business. And this introduces a lot of risk into our industry. The onus is on us as professionals and practitioners in the mining industry to make sure that we do our homework to understand what these sources of capital really mean to our business. And a good example of this is, Nathan being from BRIC, in the recent Equinox transaction which occurred, we all know that the Chinese put in an option or put in a bid for Equinox. To this day, the Chinese have not contacted the Equinox management to this day. So they were doing their negotiating through the press. They were doing their entire transaction without contacting Equinox management and sitting down to seek to understand how they could add value, where the synergies could lie, and what the opportunities are. And that's what we're really talking about here. The financing is coming from a different different place than it did in the past, number one, and number two, the way the process works is very different. So it really puts a lot of onus on us to make sure we understand what we're getting into. The second one is when supply can't match demand. In calendar 2010, it was the first time in 50 years that there was actually a shortage of copper on the world market. There was a 20,000 ton deficit in terms of what the demand was for copper versus what had been produced in calendar 2010. Now this is a first. 20,000 tons in terms of the global consumption of copper is the tip of a pinhead. It's a tip of a pinhead. It's not a big number. But it's the principle that we're getting to a point where mine grades are decreasing, demand is exploding in India and in China, and we have to try and balance these things. And this is something that I think a lot of us are concerned about, because it's becoming more and more difficult, and I'll be talking a little later about where our new mines are coming from, but it's becoming more and more difficult to find the supply to meet the demand. Because if we look at what's going on in China, the industrialization of China and India, and many of you have probably heard this, but you know, in Canada we think Toronto is a big city. Well, there's 3 or 4 Torontos a year being built in China as we speak. So if we just think of the electrical infrastructure, the water, the sewerage, the railroads, all of that kind of stuff, huge demands on raw materials which are coming from other parts of the world. And so this is really something that is a huge impact on the way we look at our industry going forward. Securing social license, Nathan has spoken to some degree about that. I think this continues to be an ongoing theme. I think the important thing here is if we look back at how we as an industry used to engage NGOs and local communities and governments and so forth 25 years ago, I would say 9 times out of 10 we would characterize the relationship as, I don't want to say hostile, but it was certainly not friendly. If we look at where we are today, our industry is embracing the NGOs, we're embracing the local communities. So we have certainly learned that we need to embrace these stakeholders much earlier in the process. However, this is going to continue to be very important for us to embrace these stakeholders, because without that license, we do not have the right to build projects, to get the materials out of the ground and to process them. And this is something that could stop projects, irregardless of whether you have the financing, whether you have the government permitting, whether you have all of that stuff lined up. If you cannot come to terms with the local community and figure out how to work with them and get them on board, the whole project is not going to happen. And there have been a couple of examples of that, but this is really something that we need to continue to focus on. New taxes and regulations. I think I can probably mention 5 or 6 examples that we're all very aware of. I think Australia is the one that has caused the most stir in the industry. The Australians with their super tax on mining profits. So this is an example of a changing environment. We've seen India introduced 2 months ago a development tax on their new iron ore projects. We've seen South Africa introduce pretty random environmental taxes which just go into general expenditure and are not even being directed at environmental investments. These are things that we're going to have to learn to live with. And what this really does for us as an industry, it pushes our level of uncertainty higher. And that's a problem, because we know that we're all looking at long-term mine lives. You know, it can be anything from 8 to 50 years. But if there's a constantly changing legislative and tax environment, it really impacts the return that we make on that investment. And we all know that we make a risk-adjusted return on the investments that we make in the mining industry. And as the risk goes up around this uncertainty, we should be making a greater return. But we all know that that's not what's happening. So this is something we really need to stand back and look at in terms of the overall context when we look at moving into new countries or looking at creating new projects or developing new projects. The level of uncertainty is increasing significantly. How to invest more strategically. Before 2008, if we looked at the the availability of funding for mining projects, there was really money available. If you had a project which was, I don't want to say marginal, but if you had a decent project, you could go and get the money to develop it by and large. If we look at where we are today, it's only the best projects that are getting the attention and are getting the funding. And what that means is we need to take a much sharper look at our investments that we're making in expanding existing mines, developing new mines, increasing production. We need to look at that very sharply because we have much more limited capital than we had in the past. And really what that means is prioritization becomes super important. This is something that is showing itself around the world. The lost generation. I'm not going to talk too much about the lost generation. I think there's been a lot of discussion around that over the last 2 days. Nathan mentioned it at length as well. This is really a problem in Canada as well as the rest of the globe. And many people think, this is just about mining engineers and geologists and, mine managers and metallurgists. It's not only about that. It's about our technical skills. It's about our truck drivers wanting, or our lack of truck drivers in remote mining areas. It's across the board. And so quite rightly, as was pointed out earlier, we do need to focus on the universities and build our skill sets. Absolutely, we need to do that. But at the same time, we need to make our industry attractive to other people because, if you offer somebody a job, let's say you're an electrician and you're from Magna and you say, well, we can give you a job in Woodbridge in Toronto, north of Toronto, or we're going to send you to Timmins, or we're going to send you to Labrador City. Obviously, we know where that's going to go. So we really need to work very hard at making our industry much more attractive to newer generations of people. I was in Australia recently meeting with some clients, and they were talking about what was going on in the Pilbara. You guys all know Western Australia, where the big iron ore deposits are for BHP and Rio Tinto. And they were basically telling me that they're paying $100,000 a year to a haulage truck driver in the Pilbara. $100,000 a year for a truck driver. I don't want to diminish the job because it's a job which takes a lot of responsibility and skill. But $100,000 for that job, that's a new paradigm. That's definitely a new paradigm. On this note, I don't know if any of you have noticed in the last couple of days Rio Tinto's primetime television campaign. I happened to notice it over the weekend, but Rio Tinto actually has a primetime television commercial which runs trying to attract talent to their business, making the mining industry very attractive. They've got very nice footage about the aluminum business or aluminium business here in Quebec and the diamond business and the iron ore business. Very interesting and fascinating. But that's a whole new paradigm. Where in the world have we seen mining companies spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on primetime television commercials to attract people to their businesses? IM Gold is another example. If you're driving into the city of Toronto from the airport, IM Gold have a billboard the width of this room up next to the Gardner, trying to attract people to go and work for them. So this is an entirely new paradigm, and this is something that's going to require innovation from us. We're not going to be able to just continue throwing money at it because that's going to make the mining uneconomical for us. So we do have to think about more creative options. The end of a rainbow. Where is the next resource going to come from? Many of the mines that are being mined today and are contributing the lion's share of the resources which we use, whether it's nickel or copper or iron ore, are mines which were largely developed in the 40s and 50s. We're now 60 years later, and we've got some really big mine projects that are being developed. But the current rate of development, we believe, is not going to meet the level of demand in China and in India. And the reality is here, there's an angle to the demand which hasn't really come up in the conversation in the mining industry, and that angle is the Chinese economy needs to continue to grow at between 8 and 10% a year to keep the number of people who are flowing in from the countryside into the cities. busy, because the Chinese central government has one fear, and that is losing control of the country. And if they cannot create the jobs, they know that they will lose control of the country. So that is the number one driver for the Chinese having to grow their economy. The second thing is, the Chinese know that they cannot allow the US dollar to get too weak, because if the US dollar gets too weak, Chinese imports start becoming uncompetitive in the US, especially with the high oil price. So the combination of a weak dollar and a high oil price, which drives expensive logistics costs, is very bad for the Chinese economy. And so what the Chinese need to do is they need to continue to buy raw materials so that they can produce and keep that economy going, and keep the US dollar higher so that they don't end up competing with the Americans. And this is something that's going on in the background. The other thing the Chinese are obviously really worried about with the weak dollar is the value of their foreign exchange investments. If you've got $30 trillion or $3 trillion and the dollar drops by 20%, that's a lot of money that you're losing right there. It's a lot of money. So, this is something that's really about where are the new resources coming from, and how much is it going to cost to extract them. We had a meeting with CIC a couple of weeks ago, which is the Chinese Investment Corporation, which is one of the Chinese government's investment bodies, and they have massive investment funds. And they were meeting with us, and they said, "We've come to Canada to invest in resources." And we said, "Sure, what kind of resources?" They said, "Well, mining we kind of covered. We've got a huge amount of investment in mining, but we're looking at timber and fish." And we said, "Oh, that's very interesting. Why timber? You can't get timber from Canada to China in a very cheap fashion because it's so far away. And why aren't you guys using Russia? You've been using Russia through Siberia for the last 100 years to supply wood to China." The answer was, they said to us, there's one railroad that runs east-west in Russia. They said the Russians have clear-cut 100 miles each side of that railroad, and now can no longer get the timber to the railroad because it's permafrost and it's just one big mud bath. So they said that's not going to work anymore. So we said, well, you've got Asia. There's still plenty of wood in Indonesia and so forth. And they said, yeah, we've got that covered. Our concern is in 25 years, when there's no more timber in Asia, we want to make sure that we have holdings in Canada that we can get to the wood no matter what the price is, because at that point we will not be able to haggle on price anymore. It'll be a question of who controls the resource. That's what they said to us sitting in our office in Toronto. They're thinking 25 years out in terms of their investments. I know my retirement investments are invested in the stock market. We think in one quarter to the next quarter in terms of our investments in many instances as investors. As mining companies, we're thinking on a longer term horizon, but the Chinese are thinking even longer. And that's really something that we need to think about when we think about developing new projects, when we think about how we work with the Chinese and how we get the synergy, the best synergy of our skills and our resources with their demand. A tough environment, I think, Nathan has spoken about that a little. Environmental legislation is not getting easier. In fact, it's getting more difficult. And this is something we really have to focus on. If we look at what's going on in China around rare earths, everybody says the Chinese are trying to control the rare earth supply to the world market as a political tool. It's actually got less to do with that than it has to do with the environmental devastation which they have caused with their own rare earth mines. As you all know, many of the metals that are found in the rare earth deposits specifically one is radioactive. So if you don't extract that, it goes straight into the tailings, and you end up with radioactive tailings. And in China, they have destroyed huge swaths of land because they've got all these tailings lying there which have just poisoned the environment. And hence, the Chinese have said we have to reduce our production of rare earths because it's destroying our environment. Working with no backbone, Nathan alluded to this a little as well, a little earlier. This is something which is becoming increasingly important. If we look at some of the developing economies in Asia and Indonesia, and specifically in Africa, the governments of those countries have seen this as a huge opportunity to take the infrastructure bogey that's on their backs and throw it over the fence to the mining companies. i.e. we've been trying for 10 years to build a railroad company. I'm going to use you as an example, Nathan. Barrick wants to build a gold mine. Okay, we need you to build a railroad as well because we haven't been able to build it for 20 years. So, oh, and by the way, we need the port too, and we need a couple of schools and a power station, and so it goes on. So this is really, the issue here is we know the grades are going down in most of our mines. So our cost to extract these minerals is going up. When you start adding these kind of infrastructure investments to those costs, it really becomes a massive, massive challenge for us to start to build these projects in an economic fashion, especially in mines that have a shorter lifespan, as some of the gold mines do, which have an 8 to 10 year lifespan. To invest in this kind of infrastructure and get a return over 8 to 10 years is very, very tough. Very, very tough. Rethinking industry fundamentals. I think the easy one here is to say, coal bed methane. Well, geez, we used to vent that stuff. Now we can drive a power station with that. So that's great. I mean, those types of opportunities are out there. But I think what's becoming more acute in the industry is the lack of energy where we need it as an industry. And we just need to look at South Africa as a country. I mean, South Africa, being a kind of well-developed mining country, but there are huge power shortages in South Africa today. I mean, I'm sure you all know that, at times the gold mining companies were rationed in terms of how much power they were allowed to use. It's a huge problem. It's really a big problem. And so what this is doing is driving the industry to start looking for alternative sources of energy and renewables as a source of energy, especially when you're very far off the grid. I must confess, though, Nathan, I don't know how many windmills you need to drive a 20,000 kilowatt ball mill, but it's probably more than anybody can count. So we're in the very early stages of that kind of stuff. But really, it's about thinking through those fundamentals and thinking about different options that we have to explore to make our industry more profitable, given that we have to put so much capital into it. Those are my slides. I think we're good on time. If there's any questions, before I forget, I have a pile of glossy versions of this research with obviously with a lot more detailed information. I'll leave those at the back next to the door. So please feel free to grab those if you'd like to. But are there any questions?
Any questions for Jurgen?
Okay, thank you very much.
If there are no any questions.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jurgen.
Thanks very much.
For a very good presentation. Thank you.